This is the Latin News Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest is Carlos Gervasoni. He is located in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and he is the Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. And we're going to be discussing, well, of course, Argentina's Milei's first year here in power, and of course going forwards with the Milei government. What can we expect, or what can we suggest might be the outcomes of the coming years? So welcome on the Latin News Podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
No, it's absolutely spectacular to be able to talk about this administration 1 year on. You have an article that has recently been published, Argentina 2024, Milei's successful and unsettling first year. That's, I don't know. I see successful and I see unsettling, and I see this as a negative. But perhaps you want to jump in and say what's gone on in this first year of the Milei administration.
Sure. A little bit of background for people who might not be completely familiar with the Milei phenomenon. Milei is your stereotypical outsider, right? Somebody who was not on the political landscape a few years ago. The party he heads and now rules Argentina did not exist 4 years ago. So he came to power sort of unexpectedly in 2023, winning elections that Peronism that was in charge was supposed to lose, but it was supposed to lose it to the Juntos por el Cambio or Cambiemos center-right coalition, the Mauricio Macri-led coalition. But this outsider came from nowhere, got 30% of the vote in the first round of the elections in late 2023, and then won the runoff election with 56% of the vote against the Peronist candidate. So it was somebody without experience, somebody without a real party, and somebody with very few institutional resources. He's the typical Latin American president that arrives to the presidency without his own legislative blocks. I mean, he had a few deputies and senators elected, but a small minority. I can go into that, why that was the case. Not a single governor, and governors are very important in Argentina. It's a federal country with strong provinces. So, it was unclear how successful he could be. And he was, in the first year, that article you mentioned is about 2024, very successful in leading a government, controlling the agenda, addressing successfully the most important demand of Argentines, that was lowering inflation. As anybody familiar with Argentina knows that inflation is always a problem. The previous administration under Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner ended with 220% inflation rate in 2023, record poverty levels. It was a real disaster macroeconomically and socially. And the most pressing demand people had was lowering inflation. Milei promised he was going to lower inflation with harsh medicine, liberal orthodox economics. He didn't try to fool anyone. He did that, and people rewarded him for that. And so his public opinion figures were quite high during 2024. He was able to assemble congressional coalitions to pass not all of his legislative agenda, but a good part of it, without his own legislators, basically relying on the support of other parties. And controlling the agenda. Basically he was the one putting the topics on the agenda, and everything was about him and his party. La Libertad Avanza, or Freedom Advances, that's the name of the party. So that's why in that title I said successful. That if you were standing in December 2023, finishing the first year with high approval ratings and inflation coming down very, very fast, was successful, right? Also, he brought, I would say, order to the public spaces. Argentina is a very, messy, I'm going to say, country in terms of how we protest. Anybody can go and cut a street for whatever grievances we might have. So unions, students, neighbors whose public services are not working well. And there was a strong demand by society that, we cannot get along in a city in which anybody can cut a big avenue, highway. So he was, successful in limiting protests so that they wouldn't disrupt other people's lives, and that brought him, public support. I said unsettling though, because he started showing some worrying signs. I'm going to just mention a few and then we can go deeper into them. One was an authoritarian style. Many people were afraid that he would be your typical right-wing populist with an authoritarian twist, right? And these sort of leaders are kind of common now in the world. Argentina did not have a far right until now. And he started kind of joining the rhetoric of, for example, something very clear, bashing journalists who were criticizing him, right? Even journalists from newspapers and other outlets that were, quite sympathetic to the economic reform program. But if they criticized any other aspects of the administration or details of the economic policy, he and his people around him in the, social networks would go after these journalists, right? And, this is not Milei, but just to get a flavor of the sort of thing they like to say, one of the people who manages the social networks of the Freedom Advances party said this phrase in Spanish is no digamos lo suficiente a los periodistas, which is something like we don't hate journalists enough, right? Like to say, journalists are the worst sort of people in the world. So that was worrying, that was unsettling. And the other thing that was unsettling, and I think that was a problem and continues to be a problem, is a sense of too much self-confidence, right? I mean, it's true that the government did well, and I think, I'm not sure if the word in English is hubris, hubris, you know what I mean? The Greek
hubris.
word for, how do you say it?
Hubris.
Hubris, the sense that you can do whatever you can because, the gods are in your favor. And even, Milei has a kind of religious rhetoric, right? Like the sort of thing of saying that sort of thing that, the forces of heaven are on my side. And so they started, you have the feeling that they can make mistakes because of overconfidence, right? A lot of that started to go on over 2025. And finally, I'm going to say something that I mentioned towards the end of the article. It's unsettling because many of us think that Argentina's problems are not so much about the right economic policy, which of course they are in many ways, right? But it's about setting the institutions right. And our institutions have been poor and weak. And there are, many of my colleagues in academia write about the syndrome of institutional weakness of Argentina, that rules are not really respected. The judiciary is, sometimes very political or not independent from the political power. And so rules have been often disrespected, property rights, and then who's gonna trust the country and who's gonna invest in a country in which rules can change and there won't be a judiciary out there to protect you. And, Milei, just to give you a hint of the sort of thing he has done that goes against this idea of institutional regeneration. The first person he proposed to fill out a vacancy in the Supreme Court, there were two vacancies, he proposed two people. One was a respected conservative lawyer, the sort of person you would expect to be nominated by a conservative president. But the other one was an insider of the judiciary, somebody with a very bad reputation, a judge already, for a reputation of being very political, of testing the political waters before deciding what way to rule, very discredited. Ariel Lijo is his name. And he nominated this person, supported him against a lot of public opposition, and ended up appointing him by decree, which is illegal, right? And then the Senate overturned Milei, and the appointment didn't go through, right? But the fact that he was so bent on appointing somebody to the court that was, he couldn't explain why he wanted that guy. And, everybody assumed the worst, right? That there was some sort of deal between Milei and Lijo to have a friendly judge in the Supreme Court, right? And that's in Argentina's business as usual, right? I mean, that's, all parties to that. So expectations that Milei was going to be different in that way did not come to happen. Just to finish this long explanation, also there has been now some serious suspicions of corruption in high level of the administration. And, Milei came with a very strong anti-corruption, anti, political establishment discourse, right? And so, if you have that discourse and then your sister is accused of corruption, which she has a very high position in the administration, then things start to be a little shaky, and that's unsettling in my opinion.
Very much so, and what you wrote in the piece is that obviously the Milei. You think the result might be the Milei presidency is likely to reinforce Argentina's frustrating political economy pendulum and continue the country's long tradition of institutional weakness. So this is really what you're saying there, and but with that in mind, we see that we see that there is public approval for his measures. There's dissent, of course, but there's public approval. But this issue of the judges and this issue of his sister are a concern. But as you say, overconfidence after successful midterm elections. To what can you attribute his midterm election success? I mean, we know that the inflation is down. Sure, great. But his austerity policies, well, yeah, okay. So inflation is down to its lowest levels in 7 years. But the fallout of this, of course, is the destruction of purchasing power and productive paralysis. So where are we going from this moment?
Richard, let me I'm gonna correct you there a little bit. I wouldn't say there is economic paralysis. When inflation goes down, a lot of people, most people win in some way, right? I mean, just having prices stable makes. I mean, I'm a consumer here in Argentina. I mean, when prices increase 5, 10, 20% per month, you don't know what is expensive, what is cheap. There is, beyond economic costs, there are psychological costs of dealing with price instability. So, and the economy has been growing, not spectacularly, but has been growing. So I wouldn't say paralysis. I would say, yeah, the economy is not doing great, but Argentina has not grown in about 11 or 12 years. So now there is a little bit of growth. We'll see if it lasts, because what we have typically is 1 year of growth, 1 year of recession, and then the overall result is that the country doesn't grow. But I think there has been people paying prices, of course, especially people in the public sector, because Milei did come with a strong mandate, and he did it to slash, unnecessary jobs in the government, and he did lower the salaries of a lot of bureaucrats and things like that. Yeah, sure, some people lost, with this. Some other people won, but overall there was a sense of relief that now we have low inflation, and Argentina has a tradition of rewarding presidents who lower inflation. It happened with Menem in the 90s. Menem was even more successful in lowering inflation for 10 years, and Menem had a good run of electoral successes and got re-elected easily in 1995. So, to what do I attribute his success in the midterm elections? Just to give the facts, Milei's party won national legislative elections a few weeks ago, October the 26th, with 40.5% of the votes. He, increased his legislative delegations, both in the Senate and the lower houses, so that now he has at least 1/3 of the votes to block any, say, impeachments or to sustain vetoes to legislation started by the opposition. So he's now stronger institutionally. And this result wouldn't have been surprising because of what I told you. His public opinion ratings were quite high, and some successes have been achieved. Only that unsettling hubris that I was afraid of started actually kicking in. The risks started materializing. In early 2025, there were a few corruption scandals that hit the administration quite hard. Then there was, I would say, a botched attempt at doing away with some government bonds called levies altogether, which actually released a lot of pesos into the economy, and those pesos went to buy dollars, which is a classic in Argentina because we don't trust the peso. So the price of the dollar went up suddenly just a couple of months before the elections, and people know that when the price of dollar goes up, inflation is coming later for quite clear reasons. So that was, and we measure at my university, at Torcuato Di Tella University, we measure trust in government index. It's a poll that we run every month. And, the government went down in July, August, September, just before the elections. So it was not clear at all that the government was going to win the elections.
Mm.
Then it went up in October, which was the month of the elections, and again in November. We released the November figure 2 days ago. And when you analyze why people voted for Milei's candidates last October, I'm going to give just very rough numbers. Some polls are saying that maybe 60% of the people who voted for Milei were convinced voters, people who thought, he's doing a good job, we should support him. And 40% of the vote, or maybe 35% of the vote, was more about being afraid of the opposition. And this is a point that is very important, and I want to elaborate on it. Being afraid of the opposition is being afraid of the Peronists. So when you read that last paragraph in my article speaking of the pendulum, right? The pendulum of Argentina's political economy. What you have in Argentina, and this is very important to understand, it's not a pendulum between the right and the left or something like that. We do have a little bit like that sort of thing. But basically, the Peronists under Kirchner, the Kirchnerist incarnation of Peronism, started in 2003 up to today, has been very hostile to markets, very repressive in terms of the rules of capitalism, right? Well, the Peronists come and you know that you will not be able to import things, but we don't have enough dollars. Companies will not be able to repatriate their profits back to their countries if they are multinational corporations. Public debt might be defaulted upon, and macroeconomic policy is going to be very loose, so there will be high inflation. So basically, when Peronism wins in Argentina, financial markets completely panic and real investors withdraw, right? So this happened when Macri lost, the day that Macri lost the primary elections. There were primary elections in August 2019, and suddenly Argentinians realized that Macri had very low chances of getting reelected and that the Peronists were about to come back. There was a completely financial crash, right? And in September, where there were provincial elections in Buenos Aires, which is by far the most important province in Argentina, and the Peronists won that election, a provincial election, there was another financial crash. Right? Basically, markets and investors and business people are completely afraid of a return of the Peronists, right? So what you have is that the fact that you have sometimes a government that is basically very poor at managing the economy, which is what happened with Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner between 2019 2023. But also the prospect that they will come back means that it's very difficult, even for a government doing things reasonably well in terms of macroeconomic policy, to kickstart growth, because who's going to trust the country if the Peronists might come back, right? I can just tell you this out of my own experience as a political analyst, right? Whenever you talk to a business person, to a corporation trying to decide whether to sink capital in Argentina or not, the most common question is, are the Kirchneristas going to come back? And that's always there, right? I think now the chance now, if I had to answer this question now, the probability of that is lower than before, because Peronism has weakened a lot over the last few years, but it's not zero, So it's very difficult to obtain progress in a country in which not only we have strong disagreements, which is normal in this world. In a lot of countries there are strong disagreements and polarization, but one of the parties that might win is completely feared by the forces of capitalism, right? And this doesn't happen in Uruguay or Chile or Brazil. If the left wins in those three countries, businessmen are okay. They may think they're going to pay a few more taxes or be slightly more regulated, but nothing dramatic will happen, right? In Argentina, that's not the case. And what my opinion about this is that a cornerstone of a future positive evolution of Argentina, if we ever eventually get out of this long cycle of decline and stagnation, will have to do with some sort of transformation in Peronism, right? Either it gets replaced as the main force on the left, or it changes and becomes a different force. Peronism has been everything over its history, right? In the 90s, it was a conservative party, right? In the 90s, with Menem, it was a conservative party running neoliberal policies with a big alliance, with a very important alliance with the US, and, becoming a kind of extra regional ally of NATO. So you describe that party as anti-abortion. It was a conservative party. Now it's a left populist party, and we don't know what it will be in the future because it doesn't. Peronism is not defined by its ideology, right? So I think there is a chance that Kirchnerism phase is coming to an end and something new will come, but we don't know what.
Well, that's it, isn't it? It's the fascination that obviously those of us who watch Argentina from overseas is this fascination that Peronism, it weakens, and it's weakened now, but we wait and see what the evolution of this party is, because Menem, conservative, then Kirchner, populist left, and so on. It just sort of, it's very fluid in order to gain power. And the present, obviously, the immediate memory for Argentines is the disastrous macroeconomic legacy left by Kirchnerism. And so there is a real fear, as you were saying, a real fear that Argentina could go back to that, and that's what gives Milei, well, a degree of his overconfidence to that. So perhaps we could talk about going forwards, in the next year. Let's talk about 2026 for Milei. What is he putting together, the plan here? I mean, is he going to liberalize the economic agenda more? And is he going to talk about more authoritarian manners of like, say, beating down on crime? What could you see?
Yeah. I mean, Milei's administration has clearly laid out what it's planning to do ahead. Basically, it wants to reform the tax system, which is widely considered very inefficient, actually regressive and very complicated. And Argentina is a federal country, so we have taxes at the three levels of government, too many, too overlapping, and so there is some sort of consensus that we need to overhaul our tax system. Of course, it's going to be a very difficult reform. Tax reform is always difficult. Then there is a labor law reform on the agenda. It will be tackled early next year, both of these reforms, tax reform and labor reform, in Congress. There is also wide agreement that Argentina's labor laws, this is a legacy of Peronism too, right? Of early Peronism that established in Argentina a very strong union system with labor laws that were very favorable to unions and that were, designed for a full employment society with no informal sector, right? But now Argentina, after 50 years of decline, has maybe 40% of its economy in the informal sector. A lot of employees are not protected by any laws because they're informal workers. And the world is changing in any case, and work is different, a lot different than it was 50 years ago. So the government is trying to pass some, I would say, not too ambitious reforms, because reforms that are too ambitious are unlikely to pass Congress. So they're trying to see what they can pass in terms of relaxing requirements to hire people, to fire people, to deregulate what companies can do in terms of their employees. And they do have also something you mentioned, a law project to increase penalties on crimes, right? To make criminal law a little tougher. There is insecurity is one of the main demands by public opinion. Argentina is not, for Latin American standards at least, a very insecure country, but it became worse over the last few decades, and there is a sense that criminals get out very easily, and they maybe get caught, and then in 2 days they're back in the streets. And typical of right-wing politics, Milei has been very emphatic in trying to harden criminal law, and I think they're going to pass some of that over the next year. And then there is a wider deregulatory agenda that is being done mostly by decree more than law. Some of the things have to be passed by law. Deregulating this and that. Argentina is a heavily regulated economy. I mean, Milei claims he is the first libertarian president in the world, and that might be the case. But if you go today to the existing indices of economic freedom, one of them by the Heritage Foundation in the US, and the second one, I mean, Argentina is still among the bottom 10 or bottom 20 countries in the world in terms of economic freedom, right? This is a country that is completely repressed by all sorts of regulations, prohibitions, and monopolies, and that is not something you do away with in a day or two. At the political level, Milei is also trying to. He has been very ambitious in constructing a political force. In a way, he has been a typical populist. In everything revolves around him. But he's constructing his party, this Freedom Advances party, trying to make the party exist in every province in Argentina, have an organization all over the country. And this is the most controversial part of the strategy, trying to actually grow at the expense of potential allies, right? The most clear case of this is PRO. PRO is Mauricio Macri's party, the center-right party that ran Argentina with allies from 2015 to 2019. And instead of going in a strategy in which you have an ally, like say European style parliamentarism, in which you win government by getting allies, or Brazilian coalitional presidentialism, in which the party of the president is one more party in the coalition, and the allies get cabinet posts, etc. Milei has been more ambitious on that, and he has, been co-opting important leaders from PRO and other parties too, and even being quite, in some ways, unfriendly towards PRO, right? So it looks like instead of trying to build a coalition, is trying to build a new dominant party. And that is also not new in Argentina, right? I mean, I would say almost every president since Argentina redemocratized in 1983 has had kind of hegemonic dreams. Alfonsín, who was our kind of founding father, very well respected politician in Argentina, who managed well the transition to democracy in the 80s, kind of thought he could stay for a long time. And Menem tried it and failed. And the Kirchners actually lasted a long time. And it looks like Milei has that sort of a dream too, right? And, I worry a little because the energies of any person or a party and government are limited, and you have to decide where you invest that energy, right? And I think, my opinion, this is completely debatable, is that this government will be better off focusing on the economic reform agenda, which is what people care the most about and what the country needs the most, and trying to gather support from whatever forces out there to help it. And there are many forces, not only PRO, there are many small parties, governors who control their own legislators, etc., willing to help, and who have actually already helped in 2024 to pass some of that legislative agenda I was telling you about earlier. And it looks like Milei is not happy with that. He wants more, right?
Yeah.
And, he clearly will run for re-election in 2027. The elections, the primary elections are in August. The first round are in October, and an eventual second round will be in November. And, we don't know what's going to happen. It's completely impossible to predict. People are making a parallel, and I think it's an informative parallel. When Macri, who was our last non-Peronist president, center-right president, macroeconomically reasonable president, all of these things, came to the midterm elections in 2017, he won them handily too, like Milei. And that gave the government a boost, etc. But then in April 2018, there was a run on the peso. There was another one of these, spikes in the dollar price, and a financial crisis coming to Argentina, and then Macri's last 2 years were difficult, and he ended up losing the election where he wanted to be reelected. So I'm not saying that this is what's gonna happen with Milei, but it tells you that this is a difficult country, and that whatever successes you have had in the past don't guarantee that you will succeed in the future. So I would like to see, humility on the side of the government and awareness of these dangers. I think the government is a little, again, still overconfident, because again, they won an election, even though all of the problems I mentioned before that happened between July and October. And I think they run the risk of drawing the wrong conclusion, which is, well, we had a corruption scandal, and we had problems with the dollar and this and that, but we still won the election, so who cares, right? And I think that would be a wrong conclusion to draw.
This is, I mean, Argentine politics is nothing if not unpredictable in that. I mean, although there's predictable unpredictables. And I suppose that with the corruption scandals, Milei's sister, and of course, proposed tax reforms and labor reforms, there will be unrest. I mean, Argentines are, they are those who are good at getting out in the streets, despite Milei's, work on stopping this. But I want to ask, and we have to bring it up, is Argentina is now acting, and it's a very different question here, but as a spoiler, I would say, spoiler status at major multinational negotiations. Of course, would you say that this is to continue to align itself with the Trump administration, in this buddy project between Milei and Trump, and then the billions and billions of dollars that have been promised to Argentina by the US?
I think I didn't speak of foreign policy. I think, let me say two words about foreign policy before I answer exactly what you asked. Milei is about economic policy, right? So everything else is not really important in his administration. And foreign policy has been actually in the previous government too, kind of, dependent on the whims of the presidents, right? So, Alberto Fernandez was famous for sitting with Putin in February 2022, 4 days before the invasion, offering Putin to use Argentina as the entrance gate to Latin America for Russia, right? And everybody knew what was coming, right? And people were wondering, why is he the only leader in the world who would sit with Putin at this point? Well, so that sort of unprofessional foreign policy, I think, carried over to Milei's administration. And so he has this obsession with Judaism. He's not really Jew, but he admires Judaism profoundly, and he has said that he would like to convert. And he has expressed deep admiration for Israel and has kind of made Argentina's foreign policy hinge to a large extent on supporting Israel, which is very weird, right? Because I mean, we have a large Jewish community in Argentina and friendly relationships with Israel, but of course, it's not an especially important country for us. And with Trump, right, which is the key point. And it looks like the foreign policy is that just aligned with Israel, aligned with Trump, and that's it, which seems kind of a very crass foreign policy. It's true that it has paid off in the short term for Milei's benefit, because part of the reason why that hike in the dollar that took place in July, August, September was finally brought under control was because of that financial support you just mentioned from Trump, from the U.S. Treasury, right? The U.S. Treasury Department, because, the conventional understanding of this is that Trump understands that the only real friend he has in Latin America, which is now kind of dominated by leftist presidents, is Milei. And Argentina is, to some extent, a strategic country more than before because of, the increasing importance of the South Atlantic in the geopolitical competition with China, and because Argentina is becoming kind of an important supplier of some critical materials like oil and gas and lithium and copper. And so they decided to help Milei with this thing, which was very unusual. I mean, the US doesn't go and rescue countries from the Treasury Department often, right? And it looks to me like it's also risky, right? Because it depends on the whims of the president of the United States. It depends on that president staying in power. And it, I think, puts too many eggs in a single basket, right? I mean, your foreign policy kind of depends, I wouldn't even say on a country, it depends on the particular leader of a country, right? So it looks to me like that it's undeniable that it has had some good consequences for Milei, maybe for the country in the short term. It's less clear that it's good foreign policy in the long term. For example, in terms of soft power. Soft power is important. And I think these days, being a strong ally of Netanyahu in Israel and of Trump in the US is not conducive to having soft power, right? But maybe Argentina can afford to give up soft power in exchange for some, badly needed financial help.
Well, as you say, I mean, we're working in the immediate future, really, here in this politics. Hopefully, the economic reforms can play into the distant future, a certain maturity regarding the economy. But I think it's been absolutely fascinating to discuss this, and I realize that we're short of time here. But it's the Milei administration is one that keeps us, don't want to say entertained, but certainly there's plenty going on. One fears about the overconfidence and the corruption scandals and how those might affect labor or tax reforms, because one side hits the other. But as you say, the La Libertad Avanza party seems to be trying to consolidate and grow. It depends whether there's, I guess, a certain degree of maturity towards the political spectrum. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to share with us?
No, just I would say that I think for whoever is watching this interview that is interested in not only in the short term of Argentina, which I think we discussed enough, I think there is something very structural about a country that has been declining for a long time. It's difficult to find. I like to highlight this every time. It's sad, but it's true, and it's important to understand. There are few countries in the world that have declined as much as Argentina over the last 50 or 70 years, right? Today, inflation is not a problem basically anywhere, but it is in Argentina. Growth is easy to achieve mostly everywhere, but not in Argentina. We have a poverty rate that is maybe 4 or 5 times higher than it was in the 70s. So it's really a story of decline with one big success, which is democracy, right? Argentina was able to build a strong and resilient democracy. And even Milei, when he loses elections, he say at the provincial level, he recognizes those results, and it doesn't seem like anybody's really threatening the democratic system in a real way, in a serious way. That's good. But for the socioeconomic development of this country that has a lot of potential, really a lot of potential in terms of human resources, natural resources, assets, intangible assets like a peaceful society, an area of the world without many conflicts, etc. We need to solve this issue of the pendulum, right? I mean, we cannot go from fiscal austerity to macroeconomic populism every 4 years and do well. That cannot happen. So I think that is, at the end of the day, is the most important challenge facing Argentina in the future.
Well, let me take this moment to say, well, that's a fantastic place to bring this to a close. Thank you so much to Carlos Gervasoni, who is the Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. It has been a great conversation with you. Thank you for your time and knowledge.
Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure. Have a good day.
This has been the Latin News Podcast. I have been your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Please remember to subscribe and tune in every fortnight for more episodes and conversations with experts from and about the region. Goodbye.